The federal government is gearing up for a massive shutdown. But is President Trump calculating that destroying the federal government in the process might just be worth it? Just what on earth makes the White House think that damaging the bureaucracy that he himself controls is going to somehow help them out? And are the Democrats still somehow willing to play ball with the White House? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Hit subscribe. Let's talk about it. Now, we are just days away from a massive government shutdown. And both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, are at least performatively negotiating, but neither side has shown any willingness to budge from their entrenched positions. Now, the Democrats have taken a stance that they are willing to pass a continuing resolution, but it's contingent on restoration of Medicare and Medicaid and other healthcare subsidy cuts that the Trump administration has rolled out. So here's what I think is, first off, if you're not in the United States, you have to understand that the U.S. has a very hard time negotiating and passing a budget. It's pretty tough. But one of the things that happens sometimes is when negotiations stall out, the federal government can play for time, and they can say, listen, let's give ourselves 90 days of funding at our current levels until we can get a budget passed. Now, right now, that is there is no budget, and they are coming to the end of a continuing resolution, a kind of budget extension. Now, the Democratic Party, here's the thing. You need 60 votes to pass this kind of budget legislation, or rather, you have to have, you have to have 60 votes essentially to pass this budget legislation through the House. So, the Democrats have said, guys, Democrats have said, should we even consider shutting down, or should we simply say, hey, let's give another 3 months, 6 months of funding to the federal government to kind of keep stalling for time and get a chance to negotiate away a new federal budget? Well, the Democrats appear to have said, no, we're going to make this a showdown. What's fascinating is that for all the terrible shit that the administration has done, the Democrats have said what we're about is actually Medicare and Medicaid, which is fine, right? Medicare and Medicaid represents the ability of millions of Americans to receive health care. This is the American safety net system. So saying, listen, we've got to go to bat for the poorest Americans. And critically, in a lot of red states, Medicare and Medicaid funds are drawn on heavily by, Trump voters, red counties, right? Trump voters tend to skew a little older. They skew a little more rural. They're very, very, and in a lot of these red rural states, older, poor Americans depend on Medicare and Medicaid. So what generally happens during a shutdown is that no federal employee gets paid, or very few, because the government isn't funded, and you can't simply pay someone with money that doesn't exist. And generally, they're told, listen, if you are essential to the functioning of the state, essential to the functioning of the government, you're like an FBI agent, right? They say, listen, you're an FBI agent. You do important stuff. You can't stop. You got to keep coming up to work, but we can't pay you. And the government says, instead, they give you IOUs. I was a part of a shutdown in 2017 when I was a Fed. And what they told me is they're like, listen, you're not important enough to do this. You don't do law enforcement. You don't do medical care. You're not doing these essential things. So you are actually prohibited from doing work. The only thing you're allowed to do is check your email to see once a day to see if you are allowed back at work. And so, but I wasn't paid during that time. But the government does give you IOUs. Why? Because I'm also not allowed to work anywhere else. Because again, the government is shut down, but I'm still an employee of the government. It's like a weekend, right? So I wasn't legally allowed to work for the Department of Homeland Security. And then, for example, I couldn't consult on weekends with a government contractor, right? That would be a conflict of interest. So they say you can't work another job, but we also aren't paying you for this one. So the general principle has been that you weather the shutdown with no money. And then when the shutdown ends, you go back, you get back pay, right? The government makes you whole. And that's usually how it goes, right? So it's a huge burden, right? Remember, the average American cannot weather a $400 expense, let alone 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks without pay. That's devastating to these families, right? They don't have a cushion. But politicians don't care about that, right? And especially not the White House. Why? Well, because the White House has already said that they're not going to be negotiating with Democrats. And you can understand why. Because, well, remember, at places, if you look on Twitter, if you look on, for example, Trump's statements after the Charlie Kirk shooting, he said basically, he's like, the American left is morally bankrupt. They hate everything good and beautiful. That's a direct quote from White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. Trump said, I don't want what's best for my enemies. I want to punish my enemies and hurt them. So, when somebody says that stuff and then they turn around and go, hey, actually, I do need your help with this thing. What you tell them usually is to go stick it up their fat something. And so, wait, are we more than a minute into this? Yeah, what you do is you tell them to stick it up their fat ass. And so that's, if the Democratic Party had a spine, they would say, you called us a bunch of fucking names. You told us, you said we were evil. You said we hated Americans. You didn't want to deal with us all. You said you wanted what's worse for us. And so you can run the government your damn self. You can pass any legislation you want. We're just not going to help you do it. And so they go and they shut down the government. Right? And they say, you run it yourselves. But the problem is that, that's a level of pettiness that I subscribe to, right? I'm somebody that's like, if you say, hey, Paul, I think you're a ghoulish evil. I think you're evil incarnate. I'd be like, listen, dude, if your house is on fire, I wouldn't go piss on it. But that's me, right? These guys are somewhat nicer. And because Democrats are, again, milquetoast and spineless. And so they say, hey, well, our stance is we're going to shut the government down unless you, again, restore some of these funding cuts you've made to Medicare and Medicaid. Well, the president is never going to do that because, well, he loves the fact that he's cut Medicare and Medicaid and he's cut other sort of healthcare programs. And so Trump has said, great, let's just shut down the government. But here's where things get even darker, right? That is because the White House has already told federal employees that, hey, when you guys are told not to come to work, you should just assume you've been fired. Now, again, the Supreme Court has recently said that that's something that apparently the president can do. Again, sure, your employment contract with the federal government says differently, but the Supreme Court, I guess, has said that a contract with the government can change at any time for any reason that they want. Surprise. And so now the White House Budget Office is telling federal agencies, hey, if we get shut down, you should simply be prepared to conduct a mass firing, targeting employees who work for programs that are not legally required to continue. Right? And you're going to have an October 1st lapse of funding. And OMB is already telling people, hey, be prepared to conduct a mass firing. And programs, right, that will continue will be Social Security, Medicare payments, veterans benefits payments, military operations, law enforcement, ICE and border protection, air traffic control. And that's pretty much it. So we're going to find out, right? So, the scary thing is that the White House might actually do this. And as we've talked about, this White House doesn't really have a great sense of policy. And conducting a mass firing and a government shutdown, remember, the U.S. actually, compared to other Western nations, has a small government where only 1/3 of our GDP is government spending. And the problem is that if you conduct a mass firing operation all at once, it's the equivalent of a massive employer just suddenly vanishing from the U.S. economy. So you're going to throw a bunch of people into the unemployment line. You're going to see a massive reduction in government spending. For example, government contractors, everybody from the people who cut the grass at your local VA hospital all the way up to people like Lockheed Martin, they just simply aren't going to get paid. And that is a huge problem when you're talking about a company that, remember, if you are shut down for 30 days of a 360-day calendar year, that's 10% of your revenue you're just not going to get. And that's a make or break. In a lot of companies, that's their entire profit. That's their hedge against bankruptcy. So the potential damage to the U.S. economy here could be extreme. But the White House doesn't care because they fundamentally don't believe that government is necessary or that government does anything good. And so when you have this kind of this collection of sort of absurd beliefs, sometimes you got to test them, right? It's just like old Steve Jobs, who really was sure that if he just ate a diet that had enough fruit and vegetables, his pancreatic cancer would go away. And you know what? Lo and behold, it turns out that the doctors actually know what they're talking about, and hippie bullshit is still hippie bullshit. Well, this is sort of the government version of that. I know this is cynical. I know a lot of people who are innocent are going to lose their jobs and have pretty terrible things happen to them. But at some point, you go, listen, find out. We're in the find out phase. So sure, you want to fire all government employees and you want to shut down the government? We're going to find out. We're going to find out what happens to an economy when you blow a 12-gauge hole through it. And as we know, of course, President Trump always chickens out. But again, I don't think that's going to be the case because I think the Democrats are probably, God, I really want to live in a world where the Democrats finally grow a spine and say, hey, you got to either play ball, you got to do things the right way. You got to recognize that just because you won an election doesn't mean you gained absolute power. Like, you're the president, you're not God. You got to play with everybody else, and you got to play by the rules. And maybe the next Republican president can learn a lesson or two about what sort of things they should say about their opposition. Calling them intrinsic inherent evil, or that they're an ideology that must be purged from existence. Okay, guys, good luck with that. So anyway, best of luck to the Trump administration in shutting down the government. And good luck to all the federal employees out there. I feel for you, but you're probably pretty cooked. But that's okay, because lots of other people have been cooked by this administration and nobody seems to give a shit. So let's find out. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Become a member at combatvetnews.com if you want me to continue to make these kinds of videos. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks to the Colonel Tier members. Again, if you want to be a Colonel Tier member and you don't want your name in this, Yanko Georgia, Bastian Himmeling, Michael Fry, Christine Schumann, Chris Holmes, Deborah Oppenheimer, you can just send us an email. I understand being associated with my channel is probably going to be politically more challenging in the future as the government kind of cracks down on all this anti-American speech that I keep using my First Amendment right to do. Anyway, see you guys in the next one. Cheers.